Dry Creek wasn't much to look at on a map, just a spatter of cabins and saloons tucked into a bone-dry stretch of earth where nothing green grew anymore. Wind cut across the land like a knife, stirring up dust that never seemed to settle. What water they had came from a single well at the town center, watched like a hawk's nest by the mayor and his militia of God-fearing settlers. The sun beat down relentlessly, painting cracks in every surface, from wooden porch steps to the calloused hands of men who'd long given up hope for rain. In such a place, kindness was rare, not because the people were evil, but because they'd spent too many years scraping out survival with their fingernails. Among these hardened folk lived a 7-year-old girl named Elsie. She wasn't much taller than a fence post, with long straw-colored hair and cheeks that always seemed flushed from the heat. Most of the town barely noticed her. She was just the blacksmith's daughter, always trailing dust behind her boots, and humming to herself in alleyways. Her mother had passed away 2 winters ago, during a particularly cruel frost that cracked roofs and froze cattle where they stood. Since then, Elsie had found solace in the one thing her mother left behind, a small hand-stitched cloth doll named Lila. The doll had mismatched buttons for eyes, a smile sewn from thread, and a little gingham dress that Elsie had mended more times than she could count. It wasn't pretty, not anymore, but to Elsie, Lila was more than fabric. She was memory. Her mother had made the doll one stormy night by candlelight, humming lullabies as she worked the needle. "So you'll never be alone," she'd whispered, brushing Elsie's bangs from her eyes. And when her mother was gone, the doll became her anchor. Most days, Elsie wandered the edge of town while her father hammered metal into tools and horseshoes at the smithy. She wasn't supposed to go too far, but curiosity often got the better of her. There was something about the open plains, the rustle of tall grasses, the calls of unseen birds that made her heart ache in a way she didn't understand. She'd sit under the shade of a broken-down water tower, telling her doll stories about distant lands and people who didn't look at you with suspicion if you smiled too brightly. Her imagination was wild, and her heart even wilder, untamed by the grimness that ruled Dry Creek. One day, as the sun reached its highest and most merciless point in the sky, the town's rhythm was disrupted. A group of native travelers, Apache by the look of them, approached the edge of Dry Creek. There were maybe 24 in all, mostly women and children, walking behind a few mounted warriors. Their faces were tired, but dignified. They carried blankets, satchels, and water skins, many of which were visibly empty. Their mouths were cracked, and their eyes scanned the horizon as if still searching for something lost to the wind. They had come, it seemed, for water. The town, as expected, froze. Men stepped off porches and rested their hands on their rifles. Mothers dragged children inside. The sheriff, a burly man with a red beard and a belly shaped like a whiskey barrel, strode to the center of the square and folded his arms. "They got no business here," he muttered, but the native group didn't cross the invisible line at the town's edge. Instead, one of the older women, wearing a shawl stitched with sun patterns, stepped forward and raised her hand, palm open, a sign of peace. Her lips moved in quiet speech, and beside her, a translator, a young Apache boy who spoke broken English, called out, "We ask water, not trouble, just water." The townsfolk didn't answer. Instead, they murmured amongst themselves. "Bandits," someone whispered. "Scouts for a raid," muttered another. In truth, no one knew. They didn't care. All they saw was skin darker than their own, clothes made of leather and feathers, and eyes too proud for people who should have bowed to the land's new masters. Even the pastor's voice, usually a balm in tense moments, said nothing this time. And so the silence thickened. Then came the voice of Mayor Granger, a wiry man with a limp and a mouth that often curled in scorn. "We have no water to spare," he called out. "Tell your people to move on." The native woman bowed her head. The young boy repeated the words to the group in their own tongue. No one argued. No one begged. With the dignity of those who have suffered many denials before, they turned back toward the trail that led through the dry pass beyond the hills. Their canteens, still empty. Their throats, still parched. Elsie had watched it all from behind a crate of oats outside the general store. She didn't understand politics, or land disputes, or the many wars that had passed before she was born. But she understood sadness. She saw it in the drooped shoulders of the women. She saw it in the cracked lips of the children. And she saw it most sharply in one particular girl, a child no older than herself, standing barefoot at the end of the line. Her hair was tangled with twigs, her feet blistered, and her arms clutched around her belly, as if hunger gnawed her insides. But what struck Elsie most were her eyes. Dark, enormous, and impossibly still. They met Elsie's with something like recognition, not a greeting, not even a plea, just shared humanity. A silent echo of pain that both children felt in different ways. Elsie looked down at her doll, Leela. She knew what she was about to do. Before she'd even decided it, her small feet padded across the dirt, one step at a time. The townspeople didn't notice at first. But when they did, when that tiny blonde girl with bare knees and dusty boots stepped past the mayor and toward the vanishing native group, a gasp rippled through the crowd. "Elsie!" someone shouted. "Where are you going?" Her father bellowed from the smithy doorway, but Elsie didn't look back. She gripped the doll to her chest, marched up to the young native girl, and extended Leela in both hands. The Apache girl blinked. Her eyes flicked to the doll, then back to Elsie's face. Slowly, as if afraid it might vanish, she reached out and took the offering. The moment her fingers touched the worn cloth, something shifted. Not in the wind, not in the heat, but in the people watching. The native girl held the doll to her chest like it was sacred. Her lips trembled. Then in a motion as delicate as sunlight, she reached out and brushed Elsie's cheek. A whisper of thanks in a language Elsie didn't know floated between them. It didn't matter. She understood. They both did. And then the moment was broken. The mayor stormed forward. "Get back here," he roared. Her father reached her just as she turned to walk back. He grabbed her arm and yanked her away. "What in God's name were you thinking, girl?" he hissed, his face pale with fear. "They could have taken you, hurt you." Elsie didn't reply. She only looked back. The Apache girl still stood there, holding Leela with both hands, her expression unreadable. The tribespeople left. They didn't drink from the well. They didn't steal. They didn't harm anyone. But they also didn't forget, and neither did Elsie. That night, as the town sat down to their meager suppers and tried to pretend the day had been normal, a strange stillness clung to Dry Creek. No laughter rose from the saloon. No fiddle played from the far end of town. Even the stars seemed unsure whether to twinkle. But in a tiny room above the smithy, a girl slept with empty arms for the first time in years. And though she missed the familiar weight of her doll, her heart was strangely full, because somewhere, beyond the hills, another little girl now held Lila close. And that, for Elsie, was enough. The next morning, Dry Creek awakened, not to the familiar clatter of hooves or the rhythmic clang of blacksmith's work, but to an eerie stillness that draped the town like a fog. Sunlight pierced through cloudless skies, golden and hot, but something in the air made even the wind hesitate. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a hum, a sense that something seen as small had shifted the invisible weight of things. People noticed it in the way their coffee cooled too quickly, or in how the water in their jugs seemed to taste different. No one mentioned the girl, no one spoke of the doll. Yet the memory burned in every glance, heavy with questions no one dared ask aloud. Elsie, still unaware of the small revolution she had ignited, sat at the wooden table beside her father, quietly stirring the oats he'd overcooked, as he did every morning. Her legs swung under the bench, but they moved slower than usual. Her doll was gone, and the absence throbbed like a missing tooth. But she didn't cry, not once. She just stared out the open window, where the sunlight spilled like honey over the dusty road that led eastward the same direction the tribe had taken. Her father didn't say much. He grunted, adjusted the buckle of his belt, and kept glancing out the window himself. Something in his eyes, usually hard as iron, had gone soft at the edges, and it unnerved him. "Ain't safe. What you did," he muttered finally. "Folks might not say it to your face, but that sort of kindness don't sit well here." Elsie turned her head. "Why not?" He blinked. A question so simple, so innocent, and yet he had no answer that didn't taste like poison. "It's just how it is," he replied, too sharply. "The past is carved deep in this dirt, deeper than you can see. But the past, as it turns out, can be rewritten. Sometimes not with bullets or treaties, but with a doll." By mid-afternoon, the whispers began. Old Mary Ellen, who ran the dry goods store, claimed she saw footprints at the edge of her garden. Not barefoot ones like a child, but moccasin prints, delicate and light. She said her fence post, which had been leaning crooked for months, had been straightened. She thought it might have been the wind, until she saw a single wildflower placed in the center of her doorstep, one not found anywhere near Dry Creek. Others began to notice oddities. The pump at the chapel well, which had creaked and stuck for weeks, now moved smoother than ever, oiled and fixed without a trace of who had done it. A broken shutter on the schoolhouse was found repaired with expertly lashed twine, and a polished pine hinge, whittled with more care than any settler might have had time for. The undertaker, a grim man named Silas, who spoke only when someone died, found his firewood stacked neat and tall, with a bundle of rare cedar at the base. He hadn't chopped cedar in years. No one had. Then came the animals. Horses known for bucking were suddenly calm. A cow that hadn't given milk in 2 weeks was found in the morning with a full udder. Chickens, long skittish from foxes and hawks, laid more eggs than usual, and their coop door, always falling from its hinges, now hung perfectly aligned. The townsfolk gathered at the saloon by sunset, murmuring like a beehive. They were settlers hardened by drought and violence, but now there was unease in their voices, not fear of danger, but fear of the unknown. Someone, was walking among them, unseen, undoing their indifference with acts of quiet grace. "It's them," said the mayor, finally, leaning over the bar. His voice taut. "They came back." "What for?" someone whispered. "Maybe for the well," another said, but deep down, they all knew. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a raid. It wasn't even about water. It was answering kindness with kindness, and it made them uneasy. That night, Elsie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her room smelled of smoke and iron from her father's workshop below. The ache of missing her doll pressed at her ribs like a stone. She tried not to cry, but her lip quivered as she remembered the little girl's eyes, deep and endless. She wondered if Lila was safe, if she was hugged, if she had someone to sing to her. Then came the knock. Soft, rhythmic, almost like tapping. Not knocking from the barn. Elsie froze. Her father hadn't heard it. The old man snored in the room across the hall. Slowly, carefully, she slipped from her covers, tiptoed to the window, and peered down. There, just beyond the beam of moonlight slanting across the yard, stood a small figure. The girl, the same Apache girl, her hair now braided, and her posture more upright. She didn't wave, she didn't speak, but at her feet sat something wrapped in animal hide. Then she turned and vanished back into the night. Elsie's heart thundered. She bolted downstairs, not caring if the stairs creaked. Out the door, into the wind. The bundle was still there. She unwrapped it with trembling hands. It was a doll, not Lila, but something new, hand-carved from soft wood, polished with herbs and oils. It had a small leather dress, stitched with tiny beads, and the eyes were painted with coal and sap. Around its neck was a strand of bones and feathers, a token of protection in Apache culture. And in its hand, a single button, one of Lila's eyes. Elsie clutched it to her chest and fell to her knees, not in sorrow, but in awe, because the message was clear. Your gift reached us, and we return it with our own. The next morning, Elsie placed the new doll on the church steps, not out of rejection, but as a message. We see you. We welcome you. It stayed there all day. No one dared touch it. By sundown, another bundle appeared beside it, a basket of wild berries, fresh-caught trout, and a small stone carving of a bird in flight. The town buzzed, but no one claimed it. The following day, Reverend Maddox, who hadn't preached with fire in years, addressed the town in trembling voice. Children see what we cannot, he said. One small hand reached across a wall, higher than any fort. And now, I wonder, will we reach back? Silence. But something had changed. It started with old Mary Ellen, placing a bag of flour beside the carving. Then the schoolteacher laid out fresh paper and pencils. Then the sheriff, face red with shame, left a canteen of water and a folded blanket. The church steps became a meeting place, a bridge. Elsie watched it all unfold from her father's porch. He never said much, but that night, he placed his large hand gently on her head. You made us remember, he said, voice thick. Made me remember that hearts don't need to be hardened just because the land is end. And for the first time since her mother died, she saw tears in his eyes. The hills echoed with silence again that night, but not the silence of emptiness. The silence of listening. Of two worlds learning to hear one another through the simplest language. Of all, a gift. The town of Dry Creek had never been particularly large or notable. It sat stubbornly between the edge of the prairie and the rising hills, its buildings huddled as if seeking shelter from wind, change, and history. It had a single church, one schoolhouse, two general stores that often sold the same goods at slightly different prices, and a saloon whose swinging doors creaked in the heat. But for all its simplicity, Dry Creek was no stranger to suspicion. Stories of the old ways ran deep, and for decades, townsfolk kept themselves apart from the nearby native tribe, not out of open hatred perhaps, but out of fear, misunderstanding, and a long chain of inherited prejudice. So when small gifts from the tribe began appearing on the church steps, beads handwoven into dazzling patterns, animal carvings of astonishing craftsmanship, a feather headdress so intricate it could have belonged to a chief, the villagers didn't quite know what to make of it. The preacher, Reverend Albright, was the first to discover the items one foggy morning. At first, he suspected thieves leaving offerings for forgiveness, but as the gifts continued day after day, and never the same thing twice, the townsfolk had to accept a new truth. The gifts were from the very people they had feared, avoided, and spoken of in whispers. The realization was slow to sink in. Old Mrs. Winchell, who had once seen an entire wagon burned near the river and blamed the tribe without evidence, was the first to speak against it. They're trying to curse us, she muttered, hunched on her porch. But others weren't so sure. The gifts weren't crude. They weren't threatening. They were beautiful, thoughtful, personal, and most importantly, they were given in silence, not demanded in trade, not offered in apology, just given. Then came the children, unburdened by their parents' wary hearts. The children of Dry Creek became the first to respond. It started with a little girl named Clara, who left a tin horse figurine on the church steps one Sunday afternoon. She had polished it for nearly an hour before placing it gently beside the beadwork. The next day, it was gone, and in its place was a woven doll with cornhusk arms and eyes made of onyx beads. This was the turning point. One by one, other children followed. They brought slingshots, marble bags, drawings scrawled in crayon, and even bits of candy they'd hidden from their siblings. They didn't ask their parents for permission. They didn't ask for explanation. They just acted from the deep well of innocence that had not yet been muddied by fear. And in response, the tribe continued to leave gifts, more dolls, tiny drums, beautifully bound feathers, hand-painted stones. A week later, the church steps had turned into something like an altar of quiet connection. No one organized it. Number 1 lead. Yet every morning, the display grew richer. Townspeople began to gather before services, not to worship, but to witness, to see what had been given, and to wonder what might be offered in return. And still, no one from the tribe had been seen. Then, one golden afternoon, as the sun hung lazily above the cottonwoods, something extraordinary happened. 5 children from the tribe appeared just beyond the town's edge, where the hard-packed dirt road met the dry brush. They came barefoot, walking slowly, dressed in simple woven garments with sun-faded colors. They stood side by side, not in defiance, not in fear, but in stillness. Behind them, barely visible in the shadow of the trees, stood 2 women, their mothers, most likely, watching with cautious pride. The townspeople stopped whatever they were doing. A man dropped his hammer mid-swing. The postmaster froze in his doorway. A dog barked, then whimpered into silence. It was the first time in nearly a generation that members of the tribe had come so close in daylight. And then, Elsie, the small girl who had given her doll in the beginning, broke the silence. She walked forward, slowly, her new doll clutched tightly in her arms. The hem of her dress dragged in the dust, but she didn't notice. When she was just a few feet from the tribal children, she paused. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then she knelt, placing the doll down gently. She gave it a soft push, sending it across the dirt to the children. For a moment, no one moved. The town watched as though the fate of something ancient was about to be decided in that patch of earth. Then one of the native girls, no older than 8, stepped forward. She knelt, picked up the doll, and smiled. From behind her back, she brought forth her own doll, made of woven fiber and dyed cloth, with beads in its hair. She placed it in the same spot and slid it toward Elsie. No words were exchanged. No adults intervened. The wind carried a dry whisper across the town square, and then it was done. The children from the tribe turned, slowly, and began to walk back, to the trees. The women behind them stepped away from the shadows and laid something down near the road, a bundle of wildflowers, tied with sinew, and then they were gone. The silence afterward was heavy, not with fear, but with awe. For a long time, no one moved. Then the preacher stepped forward and knelt by the flowers. He picked them up and brought them into the church, placing them beside the pulpit. That Sunday's sermon was the shortest he'd ever given. "I have nothing to teach today," he said. "Only to remind you, a child's heart can break down walls we've built with generations of stone." After that day, the town began to shift. Slowly at first, like the first thaw after a long winter. Mr. Hargraves, who once boasted that he never looked a native man in the eye, began to leave food bundles on the trail. Miss Penelope, the schoolteacher, asked the council if the children from the tribe might be welcomed into her classroom. A few grumbled, but none had the courage to say no after seeing the children exchange dolls in the dust. The church's front steps became an unofficial meeting ground. Not for deals, not for treaties, but for gestures, quiet, sincere, and often made by the youngest among them. One boy left his pocketknife, sharpened by his grandfather. A girl embroidered a cloth, square with the word friend, stitched beside a stick figure holding hands with another. These gifts were left at night and gone by morning. In return, the tribe left bundles of herbs, medicine roots, and tokens carved from bone and stone. No one organized it. No one organized it. No one needed to. It was as though something older than both communities, older than language, older than laws, had been awakened by a simple act of kindness from a little girl and answered by a people who had waited too long to be seen. That summer, the crops in Dry Creek grew taller than anyone remembered. The rains came right when they were needed. The animals bore more offspring. A strange harmony seemed to settle over the land, as though even nature itself had noticed the bridge being rebuilt. And while skeptics muttered that it was coincidence, most knew better. They had seen the power of a child's hand. They had watched hatred melt in the sun and in the deepest parts of themselves, the places long untouched by sermons or laws. They had remembered something true, that peace is not forged in politics or power, but in the quiet mercy of one open heart reaching toward another. By the time the leaves began to change that year, Dry Creek was no longer the same town it had been the previous spring, where once suspicion had lingered like dust in the corners of every home and business. Now something warmer had taken root. Not a perfect understanding, but a beginning. A shared rhythm between 2 peoples who had long circled each other like wary beasts in the dark. And it had all started with the doll. The transformation hadn't come from town meetings or signed declarations. No one had stood at a podium and announced peace. There were no fireworks, no formal handshake to mark the shift. The change had arrived, quietly, like the dawn after a storm, carried in the soft voices of children, the thoughtful gestures of women, the hesitant but hopeful nods of old men who had once sworn they'd never trust again. It began as most lasting things do, with small acts. Mrs. Cartwright, the baker's wife, who once refused to serve a native customer, began leaving loaves of bread at the edge of the woods. She never saw who picked them up. She never asked. But one day, a small woven basket filled with sweet berries was left in return. She told no one. But the next week, she left a pie instead. Old Eli Rutherford, a Civil War veteran known for his scowl and bitterness, found a feathered charm tied to the cane, leaned against each morning on the porch. No one admitted to placing it there, but he didn't remove it. And when he walked into town that day, people noticed he didn't complain about the heat. For the first time in years, Reverend Albright began hosting quiet evenings at the church. Not for sermons, but for storytelling. He invited the children first, then the parents. Before long, the pews were filled with townsfolk and members of the tribe sitting side by side, sharing legends, dreams, and memories passed down through generations. There were differences, of course, in the way they spoke, in the way they understood the land, but there was also laughter and tears, and silence that wasn't awkward. But sacred. Then came the Harvest Festival. It had always been a local affair, an excuse for pie contests, hayrides, and fiddle playing under lantern light, but this year, someone no one quite remembered who suggested inviting the tribe. At first, the idea caused murmurs in the general store, at the post office, and even during Sunday services. Some feared it would disrupt tradition. Others weren't sure the invitation would even be accepted. But when the sun rose on the day of the festival, they came. Not all, and not all at once, but they came, the elders first, then families, and eventually even the young warriors, whose silence once felt like a warning. They came not in full ceremonial regalia, but dressed in quiet dignity, with necklaces of bone and turquoise, belts, beaded by hand, moccasins worn from travel. They brought baskets filled with offerings, wild honey, woven blankets, hand-carved instruments. A young boy from the tribe brought a flute, and by nightfall, its song floated above the dancing, winding its way through the gathered crowd like a breeze. The celebration became something more than anyone had expected. It was no longer just a harvest festival. It became a gathering of memory and hope. Dances were shared, recipes exchanged. Children ran between the booths, laughing, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, which child was from where. One moment, in particular, stood out. Near the end of the night, as lanterns flickered and the fire crackled low, Clara, the little girl who had given her doll, stood beside the tribal girl who had once given hers in return. The two stood hand in hand, looking up at the stars. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The town, watching from a respectful distance, felt something rise in their chests. Not pride, not relief, but reverence, as if they were witnessing the turning of a page in a long-forgotten book. From that night forward, things changed more quickly. The schoolhouse added a second blackboard, one for English, the other for the native language. Children learned both. They began to exchange stories not just in games, but in lessons. Drawings on classroom walls now included not just wagons and farms, but mountains, spirit animals, and rivers drawn from memory. Miss Penelope, the teacher, invited tribal elders to speak in class. At first, they were hesitant, unsure if their words would be twisted or dismissed. But when one elder, a man with eyes like worn leather, told the story of the canyon where the stars whispered to the ground, the children sat so still that even the wind outside the window seemed to hush. Some changes were more personal. A woman named Hester, whose brother had died in a skirmish decades before, found herself talking with the mother of a boy from the tribe, a boy the same age her brother had been. At first, their words were few. Then came questions. Then came tears. Then came the day they shared tea on Hester's porch, the sun pouring over them like absolution. The sheriff, a man known more for his silence than compassion, began walking the path toward the tribal camp each morning. He claimed he was just stretching his legs, but everyone knew he was checking the trail, not for danger, but for signs, for tracks, for moments that told him they were still there, still present, still safe. And yet, not everything was easy. There were moments of tension, of course. A broken fence, a stolen chicken, a harsh word spoken out of habit. But where once those things might have ignited fury, now they brought conversation. Sometimes quiet, sometimes heated, but always with the knowledge that dialogue was better than silence, that listening was better than shouting. And then, the winter came, harsh and early. It blanketed the prairie in snow, thicker than anyone had seen in 20 years. The roads froze. The crops died quickly. The general store ran low on supplies. And for the first time since the peace had begun, Dry Creek felt fear again, not of the tribe, but of survival. It was then that the greatest gift arrived, not on the church steps, not at the post office, but in the heart of the storm. At dawn, after 3 days without fresh food, without fuel, the townspeople awoke to find something extraordinary. A line of sleds stretched from the woods to the town square, sleds pulled by horses, guided by the tribal people, and each sled carried firewood, dried meat, medicinal herbs, blankets, salt, flour, even toys. Hand-carved and wrapped in leather. No one had asked, no one had begged. The tribe had simply come. The moment broke something in the town, or perhaps healed something. Men who had once muttered suspicion fell to their knees. Women wept openly. The children ran forward, not with fear, but joy, embracing, laughing, helping unload the sleds with eager hands, and standing at the front of the caravan was the girl who had given the second doll. She looked different now, taller, stronger, but in her eyes was the same gentleness. And beside her stood Clara, wrapped in a blanket too big for her. Cheeks flushed from cold and happiness. No words were needed. The tribe didn't stay long. They returned to the woods as quietly as they had come. But the gift remained, not just the supplies, but the reminder that love, when given freely, always returns multiplied. That winter, not a single person in Dry Creek died of hunger or cold. In spring, the preacher built a second church, not a replacement, but a sister place of worship made from timber offered by the tribe. It was built with both hands and prayer. One wall bore a cross. The other, a symbol carved by tribal elders, not a god, but a guardian of balance. No one objected. By the time another year passed, Dry Creek had a new name among traders and travelers. Some called it the Bridge Town. Others simply called it the place where the gift was given. People came from distant places to ask about the peace, the stories, the dolls. They rarely left empty-handed, and at the heart of it all was the story of a girl, a small girl, who gave her most precious possession to someone she'd been taught to fear. A doll. That was all it had taken. Not a treaty, not an army, just a doll. And behind it, a heart wide enough to believe that kindness was still possible even in a place that had long forgotten how to hope.